on to the next trope talk that I am catching up on. This time, space westerns. Now, I'm curious which stuff she's going to pull from. I don't really know too many. I feel like Star Wars... does Star Wars count as a space western? I feel like it has a lot of western inspiration to it. I feel like it's gonna have to count. I'm trying to think of, like... Definitely don't have any novel. I've not read any space western novels, I don't think. Other movies that would be space westerns. I got no idea. So let's just dive in. It's not off the top of my head. I also
Whoa there, cowboy. Looks like you were fixing to head out into the great beyond without strapping on your trusty laser revolver. You don't want to run afoul of those space cattle rustlers without a piece on you. You know what they say, space is just a desert with less sand in it. So before you go riding off into the event horizon, remember to tip your hat.
Well, I mean, hold on now. Are we sure space has less desert in it, and less sand in it than the desert?
Your poncho and thank the stars you've made it this far already. See you, space cowboy. Of all the genres you wouldn't think would get along well, westerns and sci-fi feel like the most obvious candidates. Science fiction is all shiny chrome and futuristic speculation and social commentary thinly veiled behind the pretense of conceptual world building. Westerns are a borderline outdated genre mythologizing the taming of the Wild West to the point of complete fictionalization, packed full
the whole 12 Western fans out there are going to be upset about that, Red.
Of stock characters populating a single-digit number of plot lines that usually revolve around sheriffs versus outlaws, cowboys versus Indians, railroad tycoons versus underdog homesteaders, or one of about 3 Kurosawa movies with the serial numbers filed off. Future versus past, high-tech versus low, infinite diversity and infinite combinations versus the most literally and figuratively whitewashed concept this side of Jesus Christ. And yet, inexplicably, there is a small but vibrant genre that thrives in the overlap of these two paradigms.
Small? I don't know. Star Wars is pretty big. Again, I'm going to continue to say Star Wars is part space western.
That feels like they should be 2 circles on opposite sides of the room. Where the Old West meets the star-spangled blackness of space, the final frontier, we find the space western. And from a certain point of view, we might find that these genres have a little common ground after all. Science fiction may be shiny and chrome, but a large swath of the genre was inspired by the allure of exploring the unknown frontiers of outer space. Maybe someday we could even plant permanent colonies on other planets, mitigating concerns of overpopulation or allowing us to mine resources that were abundant on other worlds. Science fiction saw outer space as something valuable and open and free, something that if we got our act together and buffed our technology to new levels of reliability and accessibility, we could potentially explore and even settle. With a new understanding of how big the universe really was, some authors started to see Earth as only the beginning, just the nest that we were ready to leave so we could spread our wings and fly to new heights. Imagine a farming colony on a moon of Jupiter, a diamond mine on an asteroid, a whole new world of OSHA violations and worker exploitation to explore. Remember, this is sci-fi. Some of it is optimistic, but most of it is built on the idea that humans will still be basically the same in the future as we have been in the past. So now your CEO can skim your wages in space. But seriously, outer space is an inspiring thing. People look to the skies and dream of what they might find up there, what it might be like to strike outwards and upwards into the great unknown. And when we look for a frame of reference of what it might be like to take our first steps into a dangerous, wondrous unknown and tentatively find a way to put down roots, there is a genre of fiction that purports to describe exactly that. The Old West was a hostile place, unexplored and unknown to the colonizers that were carving out homesteads and townships to shelter from the uncharted dangers of the New World. Lured by the promise of wealth, freedom, and land for the taking, these people risked it all to venture into the vast unknown and brave dangers inconceivable to the city folk back home. So if you put that in space, some synergies start to manifest. Instead of your wagon train on the Oregon Trail, you've got your spaceship with its limited supplies and storage space, your only fragile lifeline in a hostile environment, and you better hope it doesn't lose a wheel or get washed downriver in a storm. Instead of your frontier town, you've got a planetary colony, cut off from its homeland by the limitations of light speed rather than by physical overland distance and the limitations of a horse. Rapid expansion could stretch the surface area of civilization faster than the law enforcement can keep up, leading to a spike in outlaw activity regulated only by lone rangers doing their best to keep the peace in a lawless land. A railroad line coming through could transform an Old West town for better or worse, since fast and efficient travel is an economic game changer. A hyperspace relay can do the same thing to a far-flung space colony. A planet with an unexpected treasure trove of some natural resource could spark an extraterrestrial gold rush and a sudden influx of prospectors and boom towns, while a natural disaster could
Where's
leave
my
a
dog
fragile
barking
colony
at?
or
Hold on.
isolated homestead cut off from civilization and help. If space is the final frontier, it stands to reason that the exploration and colonization of that final frontier could thematically and structurally mirror the exploration and colonization of the Western frontier. And I mean, if you already have an entire genre of film language and stock characters to play with, why not use them? To understand the space Western genre, we need to do a little homework and break down the Western genre, mostly because its heyday has been over for decades and the cultural environment that fostered it has completely changed, leaving large swaths of the genre outdated, deprecated, or just broadly confusing to a more modern audience that hasn't been exposed to it so much. Author Frank Gruber, who wrote a lot of Westerns and therefore probably knew what he was talking about, claimed there were only 7 plots in the Western genre. The Union Pacific story, where the plot is about building some newfangled technology like a railroad or telegraph line. The Ranch story, which is about a cast of characters on a ranch protecting it from ne'er-do-wells like cattle rustlers or wealthy landowners trying to force them out. The Empire story, where an underdog builds some sort of resource empire in a rags-to-riches kind of way. The Revenge story, which is exactly what it says on the box. The Cavalry and Indians story, which is all about taming the wilderness and fighting off those darn pesky people who were here first. The Outlaw story, which is about cool, badass outlaws doing outlaw things. And finally, the Marshal story, which is about the marshal/sheriff/assorted lawmen trying to get those aforementioned cool outlaws in line. These plots aren't unrecognizable, but they're not really all that applicable nowadays. The part of the Western genre that's had the most staying power is the space of stock settings and the cast of stock characters that populated the stories, probably since they translate most easily to other genres. Stock settings include boom towns and ghost towns, which spring up around desirable resources and dry up as soon as the resource does, and of course, and I need you all to do me a solid here and picture the absolutely massive air quotes I'm putting around Injun territory, for the wild lands between the pockets of civilization that are inhabited by scary people who might ambush your transports and kidnap your more kidnappable teammates. Visually, these environments are almost always posted up in reddish deserts and cliffs with tumbleweeds as the only reliable vegetation, and that plus a
Of course, Red uses this show as an example. It's been a while. I don't think she's used it in the last couple Trope Talks I watched, but this one's a staple. This is one of her most consistent shows she uses.
Street of 1 to 2 story unpainted wooden buildings paints the Old West picture very clearly. Western stock characters include a wide swath of protagonists, antagonists, and supporting crews, with protagonists usually being drifters, gunslingers, cowboys, bounty hunters, or some combination of the four. Antagonists usually being rogue bands of outlaws, scary native raiding parties, powerful and wealthy cattle barons, even more powerful and wealthy railroad barons, or small-town tyrants who rule their pockets of civilization with an iron fist. The supporting cast is where the genre gets weirdly specific with it, as you might encounter such colorful characters as the sheriff, who's the law around these parts, the mountain man, who lives out in the wilderness and wears at least 4 dead animals at all times, the snake oil salesman, grifting the locals with miracle cures, the frontier doctor, who's the only source of legitimate medical practice for 100 miles and is probably not happy about it, the saloon owner, who knows everyone and just wants the rowdy folk to keep their fighting outside his respectable establishment, the brothel madam, who runs a tight ship in a house of ill repute, the school marm, who handles 100% of the kids' education, the preacher, serving as a spiritual community leader, the bundle of tropes that is the native guide / noble savage / magical Native American, who is one of the scary indigenous locals but actually likes our protagonists and thus gets
Yeah, that one's a problematic trope character.
to hang around with them, the prospector, camping out on the hunt for gold in them there hills, and his older associate, the 49er, who's an unsuccessful veteran of the California gold rush. These characters, while in many cases oddly specific, do translate well to other genres. Drifters, gunslingers, bounty hunters, and outlaws work in any concept that has guns, crime, and money. Cowboys are a little more precise, but the concept of a cowboy usually has a lot less to do with the actual cattle ranching job that was performed by cowboys, and more with the aesthetic of a badass in a cool hat who's good with a lasso and handy with a horse or horse equivalent. And the specific stock side characters basically work in any setting where the population is low enough that you'd expect at most one person to be doing any given necessary job that serves a small community that relies on that job. The sheriff has to be the whole law because there's basically only one of him, with maybe a deputy or 2 to help out. And there has to be a law because there's enough people around that it can get broken. The frontier doctor is working alone because there's no one else around who can help, but they need the doctor because everyone gets sick or injured sometimes, etc. Even weirdly genre-specific ones like the Prospectors can theoretically pop up anywhere with a hint of precious natural resources around. It's surprisingly easy to see how these stock characters could translate smoothly into a space colony with minimal difficulty. Even the character archetypes that have aged horrendously in their original context can be cleaned up for modern consumption with a little sci-fi movie magic by replacing, for instance, scary engines out in engine territory with things like scary monstrous aliens, which are categorically not people and therefore skip over most of the moral dilemmas unless you think about it too hard. Some space westerns.
I mean, I feel like as long as you're not stupid, and like, as long as you don't give the alien, like, yes, obviously, in the context of the space western, if you're using actual, like, monsters, like arachnids or whatever, people who recognize the trope will recognize that you are using these monsters in place of what was, once indigenous Americans. But I don't think, I mean, obviously I say this as a white guy, but I don't think people will look at that and necessarily see a problem. You're like, okay, you're taking a trope that was once a staple, is problematic, and like the you are using monsters, like actual monsters, non-human creatures, non-humanoid creatures, in place of what was, a problematic thing. I don't think that's where the issue is. I think it's once you start giving a culture to a non-humanoid species, that's when it will be start to become problematic. Oh my god. Because you might end up taking inspiration from non-white cultures to make. That's where it's a problem.
Will scrap the native population concept.
Obviously, that was a very brief discussion regarding how to write things. Like, genuinely, if it's just a horde of monsters, I don't think there's be a problem with that. As long as you don't give them a culture. The moment you give them a culture, that's when it can become problematic, depending on how you handle it.
Altogether, and have our heroes setting up colonies on completely barren worlds, possibly freshly terraformed up from bare rock, or expanding out into space and just finding no aliens anywhere, so the only drama they have to contend with is other space colonists up in the lawless void. As a genre, space western is working with some pretty big-name DNA, although the family resemblance isn't always immediately obvious. For one thing, Star Trek was originally pitched by Gene Roddenberry as Wagon Train to the Stars, explicitly referencing a Western TV show called Wagon Train about, shocker, a wagon train making its way west to California and encountering colorful characters and interesting settings at a rate of about one per episode. So as pitched, Star Trek would have been a classical Western in space. This turned out to be a bit of a bait and switch, though, because actual Star Trek was far less interested in space colonialism as it was space exploration, with the world peace post-scarcity society of the Federation pretty much eliminating the concept of the underdog protagonist, as well as all the potential colonialist motivations for stripping planets of their land and resources that are implied in the substrate of the westward expansion, and the prime directive keeping our heroes from getting too aggressively paternalistic with the new life and new civilizations they encountered on the way. Rather than a story of underdog survival in a hostile land, Star Trek turned out to be more of a weird Planet of the Week situation, with very little aesthetically in common with the Western genre inspirations it purported to have. Interestingly, as the series progressed and spawned spin-offs, Western tropes found their way back in. Some in Voyager, which actually does have the wagon train format of trying very hard to get from point A to point B despite the tribulations. Plus, because our heroes are stranded so far away from the Federation, they are indisputably the underdogs in almost every conflict. But the Western tropes are most explicit in Deep Space Nine, whose core cast features, among other stock characters, the sheriff who's the law around these parts, the frontier doctor very excited to ply his trade in the far-flung edges stages of civilization, and the saloon owner and his house of ill repute. But leaving Star Trek behind for a minute, in the weird famous cousin department, Star Wars kicked off in 1977 with a barely reskinned retelling of Akira Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress, plus a very un-Kurosawa World War II dogfight in the third act. The works of Kurosawa were incredibly influential on the spaghetti western movie genre, with Seven Samurai being remade into The Magnificent Seven in 1960, and Yojimbo being unofficially remade into A Fistful of Dollars in 1964, with the unnamed cowboy Clint Eastwood taking the role of the unnamed Ronin Toshiro Mifune. And when I say unofficially remade, I mean they legally had to pay Kurosawa royalties about it, and they would have made more money if they'd just asked. So while Star Wars isn't exactly a space western, it's drawing on the same source that many westerns used, and you can kinda tell. While pretty much everything to do with the Empire is very much its own thing, and the Jedi draw strongly from Kurosawa's samurai movie energy, Tatooine is absolutely crawling with space western tropes, with the hostile desert environment and its dangerous wild folk, the isolated farmstead, the rowdy saloon, the bounty hunters, the quick-draw gunfight, and even the scruffy lone gunslinger outlaw they pick up along the way. But despite these tropes, Star Wars isn't what we'd consider a proper space western.
What? Bullshit. I disagree.
I mean, we can all kind of see that it isn't. It has too much going on that isn't in the space western aesthetic. And
It's got the stock. Okay, I guess.
the aesthetic really is key. Space westerns have a suite of stock characters and settings to play with, but the genre is much more strongly defined by aesthetic than by narrative format, which can make it pretty easy to eyeball whether or not something counts. And this does make sense. The western genre is almost completely deprecated. It's not really written for anymore, it's just referenced, and those references are drawing on its vibes. Space western is a blend of the western
bro.
aesthetic of cowboy hats, long coats, desert and scrubland, lone gunslingers and seedy saloons, small communities carving out space in a big hostile world, and the space aesthetic of starships, robots, lasers, cybernetics, and the great starry beyond. Plenty of stories built up to this aesthetic blending without quite hitting that bullseye. Star Trek has structural elements in common with both genres, but almost no western aesthetic, while Star Wars has a bit of the aesthetic, but none of the colonizing the new frontier narrative. Later installments of Star Wars would aim for the space western genre, with Solo a Star Wars story checking off pretty much all the boxes, and later The Mandalorian getting a lot more explicit with it. A lone gunslinger bounty hunter with the word economy of a sniper gets roped into a lone wolf and cub plot on a desert planet. Even the Empire is reframed in this version to fit a more western antagonistic structure, stripped down post-Emperor explosion so it's no longer a monolithic force of faceless evil, but instead a series of petty small-town tyrants exerting what little power they have over people who can't fight back. But obviously this is all very recent. It's drawing on an existing space western genre rather than pioneering it. The first story I can find that explicitly hits right in the middle of space and western is 1986's The Adventures of the Galaxy Rangers, which I had never watched before on account of how I wouldn't be born for another 10 years. But the genre's right there in the name. Rangers like the Lone
Wait, hold on,
Ranger.
what years did she say?
86's The Adventures of the
86? So she's 1996. I'm 98. Okay.
Galaxy Rangers, which
Oh,
I had never
I know our
watched
age
before
gap.
on account of how I wouldn't be born for another 10 years. But the genre's right there in the name. Rangers like the Lone Ranger means Western, and if you put those bad boys and girls in a galaxy, you get Space Lone Rangers, who are courageous pioneers committed to the highest ideals of justice and dedicated to preserving law and order across the new frontier. With their shiny sheriff badges, robot horses, and gunslinging tricks, they're very specific in their aesthetic, even if the majority of the rest of the show is very hokey 80s sci-fi. Then 1 year later in
It's giving very hokey 80s sci-fi.
1987, Mattel released Brave Star, which was a very western in space, set on a desert planetary system called New Texas, with a Native American space lawman arriving on a very Old West-looking desert world to get a handle on some of the rough-and-tumble space outlaw activity. It's a classic western plot of a new sheriff in town, everyone has a Texan accent, and it's undeniably very much both a western and in space. This, weirdly enough, does kind of feel like the exact moment
The horse can walk on two. Okay.
a lot of the space western aesthetic got locked down. But it kind of feels to me like the genre wasn't really capable of taking itself seriously at this point. I mean, these are both extremely kids shows. This might be because A, science fiction was also seen in pop culture as kind of a hokey childish nerd thing, despite the bulk of science fiction literature being profoundly fucked up, and B, the western
And also, like, I'd say profound majority of it being probably geared towards adults. I'd say, like, we've by the 80s, we have gone through the golden age of sci-fi, Asimov and that stuff. Which I would say they probably wrote. I mean, a lot of writing in that 50s to 60s, 40s to 60s time frame, 50s, 60s, 70s ish time frame, whatever the golden age really is. Probably was definitely more ambiguous in terms of its audience, I'd say. Like, because the marketing hadn't come to it yet. The marketing departments hadn't clamped their teeth down and been like, no, we're gonna market this for children. This is actually a children's novel, blah blah blah. But yeah, I say it was more like the idea that sci-fi is for kids is pure fucking marketing.
Western genre was already being looked at very critically at this point, with so-called revisionist westerns pretty much eclipsing the rest of the genre with the relaxation of the Hays Code in 1968. Revisionist westerns broke down the black and white morality of good civilization versus bad guy uncivilized natives that the earlier westerns laid their foundations on. So revisionist westerns could feature Native American protagonists, less clear-cut lines between good and evil, and even ladies with agency and shit. The western genre was already being thoroughly unpacked, critically examined, and subverted.
So it's possible that America's pioneer narrative might not actually be above moral reproach like we hoped. Can I still keep the hat?
When the first codified space westerns were starting to cook, so the classic tropes of the western were maybe a little bit less popular and therefore less likely to get much uncritical airplay. The first space western I can find that takes itself seriously is the manga Trigun, which started in 1995 and sort of heralded a wave of space western anime that leaned a lot more serious and, for want of a better word, adult than the Brave Stars and Galaxy Rangers of the world. Trigun plants itself on the desert planet of Gunsmoke, a nearly failed space colony that only survives in small-town pockets built around plants. Sci-fi alien power plant angel ladies that are the only way to produce the water and other resources these towns need to survive. Outlaws abound, and our protagonist, Vash the Stampede, is constantly on the run from bounty hunters after his head and the associated money they'll get for it. Saloon shootouts, like badass gunslingers, duels at high noon, preachers with hidden agendas, mysterious drifters wandering through town. Aesthetically, this is the Old West, but some people have robot arms, and instead of a well, every town relies on an angel lady and a light bulb. This setting enables a ton of classic Western vignettes, and really the only difference between it and the classical Western setting is a little bit subtle. In the Old West, civilization was constantly expanding and encroaching, and any far-flung town could potentially find themselves on a railroad line in the next few years. Things were transient and temporary because the situation was constantly changing, sometimes for the worse, sometimes for better. But Planet Gunsmoke is on its own and not doing great. Nobody's coming to help, and there's very little that can be done, so everyone's just kind of eking out the best living they can in a bad situation. It's like it managed to be a post-apocalypse before they even had a pre-apocalypse. Shortly after Trigun started, 1996 kicked off the manga and later anime adaptation of Outlaw Star, a fairly short but very archetypical space western where the
you know what? I was not expecting us to get into manga and anime for this episode. I guess it makes sense.
Sudden advent of FTL travel leads to rapid interstellar expansion and colonization, and civilization basically expands at a faster rate than the law can keep up, leading to a wild and chaotic frontier civilization running smack into all kinds of weird stuff, including some aliens. This is a classic Wild Edge of Civilization premise, with the only change being that the Wild Edge of Civilization is in space. Our protagonists take on odd jobs for cash to keep their spaceship maintained while they hunt down the main MacGuffin of the series. It's good, clean fun, and it sure as hell is a western in space. Then, in 1998, the game changed when we got Cowboy Bebop.
Actually, that was the one I was thinking of at the start of the video. If there was going to be any reference to manga and anime talk, I was like, Cowboy Bebop. But I just didn't say it. I knew I should have said it. But I was like, I don't know too much about it to really, talk about it. So I was just like, would that count as space western? I'm not sure. I should have trusted my gut. I should have said Cowboy Bebop.
A crew of bounty hunters chasing down outlaws for cash and taking the occasional break to be sad about their lives. The Old West vibe is aided structurally by the fact that Earth is nearly completely uninhabitable, so most people live in off-world colonies which rely on contracted bounty hunters to enforce the law in a sprawling, decentralized civilization with no real overarching government that can keep control. So this is another case where the setting is structured to serve the Old West aesthetic of cut-off frontier towns. This show, of course, was incredibly popular and rewired a lot of brains, and I'd say it probably helped bring an edge of noir cyberpunk angst to an otherwise still somewhat hokey genre of gunslinger cowboys in space. Of course, when you say space western to a Western audience, a lot of people probably jump straight to Firefly, which came out in 2002 and was extremely dedicated to capturing the wild frontier vibe of the Old West in the new, uncharted context of expansionist space colonization. The opening number was strummed soulfully on a guitar. The protagonists were pulled from the Old West toy box almost directly, with long-coated gunslinger outlaws, a frontier doctor, a preacher, a lady of the night with a heart of gold, and then a few sci-fi specific roles to fill with the pilot, the engineer, and the mysterious girl in a box shipped direct from the first episode of Outlaw Star. Pretty much every episode that took
the angle was almost like the camera shot was almost the exact same from Outlaw Star.
Place on a planet would be happening in a frontier town parked in a newly terraformed but otherwise completely empty planet. They even ride horses sometimes. Firefly captured a hell of a vibe despite starting from a hell of a premise for its protagonist. What if we did like a Western thing, but the hero was a guy who'd been on the losing side of a civil war of some kind? What a completely innocuous concept that certainly doesn't carry a devastating massive implications along with it. Now, Firefly does not in any meaningful way make out Captain Mal and Zoe to be space Confederates, obviously. The vibe of this particular fictional space civil war is clearly a lot more Star Wars heroic rebellion against a tyrannical attempted imperial unification than it is in any way similar to the real Civil War, which, despite a couple centuries of attempted revisionist history, was abundantly about several states in the US wanting to continue owning human beings. But the nature of parallel and allegory does unfortunately mean that planting a space civil war in the background of a space western draws very obvious lines to the real Civil War in the background of real westerns. And the problem there is that implying the losing side of that real historical conflict was just a bunch of sympathetic rebel underdogs with completely noble motivations that had nothing to do with owning human beings for infinite free labor is genuinely a real conspiracy theory that some people really believe. Which is just really sad at this point, guys.
Yeah.
I'm confident that Firefly was not setting out to say that, but I'm bringing it up because it does illustrate an interesting problem in the space western genre that we've sort of danced around up to this point. That being the western baggage. As discussed, the western genre was in many key ways whitewashed, revisionist, dehumanizing to everyone but the bold pioneers, and framed around the intent to mythologize and lionize the process of westward expansion into a bunch of cool, sexy hero narratives. It's rooted very strongly into a real chunk of history that it was explicitly designed to glamorize or even overwrite in the minds of its audience, and that's been something people have looked askance at since the genre kicked off. There's a reason revisionist westerns got so popular, and why classical westerns have fully fallen by the wayside. Revisionist westerns were interested in unpacking a lot of the stuff that classical westerns preferred to gloss over. The genre of space western is extremely new and undergoing rapid evolution, and a lot of what it's had to grapple with is the fact that the western genre is old and rough-edged and in desperate need of some updates. Lots of the aesthetic.
Well, but here's the thing with updating the Western aesthetic and stuff. I don't think you can. I think the Western baggage is pretty much inseparable from the Western inception. Like, the Western frame is that problematic origin. Like, the simplicity of its characters is often what people want from a Western. People that are fans of Westerns, I don't think are fans then of, I don't know how to word this right, so I'm going to stop myself.
Of the Western can be, for the most part, cleanly lifted from one setting to another without carrying anything more than the implications that cowboys are cool. Gunslingers in long coats, lassoing varmints from horseback, all of that is completely chill. We here at OSP absolutely condone lassoing varmints from horseback. But because the Western genre was laid down over the minefield of early American history, innocuous cool fictional ideas like what if the heroic Star Wars rebels lost and had to deal with that can put their foot through a loose patch of turf and set off an absolute explosion of think pieces and Reddit threads. It doesn't help that Whedon said he was, in fact, explicitly inspired by reading books
Yeah, but no one should listen. Don't listen to Joss Whedon. He's dumb.
about the American Civil War. So, like, it's not just conspiracy theories to draw this connection. It was clearly on his mind when he was writing this. And I actually think this is a big part of what's driving the increasing popularity of the space western. There is a lot of cool stuff in the western genre. It's just a shame about all that baggage. So if a writer can take the cool aesthetic and the setting tropes and the interesting, unique challenges of frontier living and completely uproot them from their origins in revisionist history, they can theoretically be cleanly applied to a completely new, fictional, speculative setting without carrying any of that extra weight. Cowboys are cool. Shame about that context. The Lone Ranger's cool as hell. Shame about that whitewashing. These unknown threats in the darkness around town are so spine-tingling. Shame they're real human beings with completely understandable grievances and stuff. If you take the Western out of the Old West and put it in a speculative setting like outer space, theoretically you can tell whatever Western story you want without it feeling like you're trying to make any unintended points about real American history. Of course, in practice, that's not really how it works. Pattern recognition's gonna happen and connections are gonna be drawn no matter how much a writer tries to scrub off all the contextual serial numbers. But it is definitely...
That's kind of what I was trying to imply, that's what I was trying to get across when I was saying how the problematic roots of the Western setting is almost inseparable. I believe inseparable from it, and it's because of that pattern. Helped
decouple a lot of the Western tropes from the context they originally formed in. Cowboys as a concept have become almost completely free range. It feels like there's an interesting ongoing attempt to pick out only the cool parts of this big, complicated, kinda iffy genre and transplant them into an entirely fictionalized setting where they can grow and thrive in new alien soil. Which is, frankly, completely thematically appropriate. So, yeah. Because I'm a cowboy.
That was Trope Talk Space Western. I got nothing else to add here at the end. Nothing new. So let me know your thoughts on this trope down in the comments below, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye-bye. Did I say it like that?